The economic integration is a term used to describe political and monetary agreements among nations and world regions, in which preference is given to member countries. There are three major ways to approach such agreements. First is global integration. Countries from all over the world decide to cooperate through the World Trade Organization. The global integration is the degree to which the company is able to use the same products and methods in other countries. The next agreement is bilateral integration, wherein in this, the two countries decided to cooperate more closely together, usually in the form of tariff reductions. Next agreement is regional integration. A group of countries located in the same geographic proximity decided to cooperate as with the European Union. It is the process by which two or more nation-states agree to cooperate and work closely together to achieve peace, stability, and wealth. The World Trade Organization Global Integration. Governments often actively cooperate with each other to remove trade barriers. The following discussion focuses on the World Trade Organization, the successor to the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade, and the major multilateral forum through which governments can come to agreements and settle trade disputes. The World Trade Organization is the only international organization dealing with the global rules of trade. Its main function is to ensure that trade flows and smoothly, predictably, and freely as possible. Ang main function ng WTO or World Trade Organization are administering World Trade Organization trade agreements, providing forum for trade negotiations, handling trade disputes, monitoring members' trade policies, providing technical assistance and training to develop and least developed economies, and also cooperating with other international organizations. Next is GATT, the predecessor to the WTO. In 1947, 23 countries formed GATT under the auspice of the United Nations to abolish quotas and reduce tariffs. By the time the WTO replaced GATT in 1995, 125 nations had become members. Many believe that GATT's contribution to trade liberalization enabled the expansion of world trade in the second half of the 20th century. The purpose of GATT was to eliminate harmful trade protectionism. Based on my research, there has a pros and cons of GATT. First is the pros. The first pros is GATT encourage international trade. And the second is countries with trading agreements are less likely to go to war with one another. Another is the success of GATT inspired other international deals and organizations. And lastly is that trade increased communication, wherein these are the cons of the GATT. The domestic industries that can compete globally will likely fail. Another is the globalization of industries exposes more of the world to risk within that industry. The trade agreements could overrule domestic law, forcing governments to some level of control over their citizens. And the last cons is Small economies and businesses may struggle to compete with the large economies and businesses. What does the WTO do? The WTO adopted the principles and trade agreements on reached under the auspices of GATT, but expanded its mission to include trade in services, investment, intellectual property, sanitary measures, plant health, agriculture, and textiles, as well as the technical barriers to trade. In its 159 members collectively account for more than 97% of world trade and include the BRIC countries. The BRIC countries are Brazil, India, China, and Russia, which was finally admitted to membership in 2012. The entire membership makes significant decisions by the consensus. However, there are provisions for the majority vote in the event of a non-decision by member countries. Agreements then must be ratified by the governments of the member nations. The most favored nation, the WTO continued the MFN clause of GATT, which implies that member countries should trade without discrimination, basically giving foreign products national treatment. Although the WTO restricts this privilege to official members, some exceptions are allowed as follows. The first is developing countries manufactured products have been given preferential treatment over those from industrial countries. Consciousness granted to members within a regional trading alliance, such as EU, have not been extended to countries outside the alliance. Recall from our opening case, for instance, that although EU members can export and import cars from other EU nations without limitations, Japanese car makers must comply with strict import tariffs. Next is the countries can raise barriers against member countries who they feel are trading unfairly. Exceptions are made in times of war or international tensions. The dispute settlement. One function of the WTO is garnering growing attention is the organization's dispute settlement mechanism, in which countries may bring changes of unfair trade practices to a WTO panel and accused countries may appeal. The next is the Doha Round. Doha Round is perhaps the most complex issues the WTO currently faces. However, are those it is trying to address through the Doha Round, also called the Doha Ministerial Declaration, which commenced in Doha, Qatar in 2001 with a focus on giving a boost to developing countries on the world scene.
The rise of bilateral agreements. As the negotiation over the Doha Round broke down, many countries began to shift to bilateral or preferential, rather than multilateral free trade agreements. In 2012, for example, the U.S. signed free trade agreements with Colombia and South Korea, both of which reduced tariffs and other trade barriers for industrial products and agricultural products while strengthening intellectual property rights and trade in services. Even though bilateral trade is much simpler than trying to forge a deal in the World Trade Organization, neither deal was easy, and it's always difficult to measure the impact in the short run, especially during a time when the global economy is struggling. The rise of bilateral agreements confers favored trading status between two nations by giving them access to each other's markets. It increases trade and economic growth. The next is regional economic integration. Regional trade agreements are reciprocal pacts between two or more partners that lie somewhat between bilateral and global integration agreements. According to the World Trade Organization, 354 RTAs were in force as of mid-January 2013. The regional economic integration is best be defined as an agreement between groups of countries in a geographic region to reduce the ultimate remove tariffs and non-tariff barriers to the free flow of goods and services. The geography matters. It is logical that most trade groups contain countries in the same area of the world. Neighboring nations tend to ally for several reasons. The reason is the distance that goods need to travel are short. Consumers' tastes are likely to be similar and distribution channels can easily be established. The two main types of agreements are free trade agreement and custom union. The free trade agreement is goal of to abolish all tariffs between members countries. It usually begins modestly by eliminating them on goods and already have low tariffs, and there is usually implementation period during which of the tariffs are eliminated all products included in the agreement. And the last type of agreement is custom union. In addition to eliminating internal tariffs, member countries levy a common external tariff on goods being imported from non-members in order to establish a custom union. The next is the effects of integration. Regional economic integration can affect member countries in social, cultural, political, and economic ways. Initially, however, our focus is on its economic rationale. The two effects are static and dynamic effects. Regional economic integration reduces or eliminates those barriers for member countries, producing both static and dynamic. Static is the shifting of resources from inefficient to efficient companies as trade and barriers fall. Dynamic effects are the overall growth in the market and the impact of a company caused by expanding production and by its ability to achieve greater economies of scale. The static effects occur when excess of either plus or negative charge become confined in a small volume isolated from charge of the opposite polarity. The static effects may either two condition occurs is trade creation and trade diversion. Trade creation production shifts to more efficient producer for reasons of comparative advantage, allowing consumer access to more goods at lower prices than would have been possible without integration. Trade in diversion. Trade shift to countries in the group of the expense of trade with other countries, even though the non-member companies might be more efficient in the absence of trade barriers.
Major regions to look at different regional training groups are by location, such as the European Union, and by type, such as FTA, Customs Union, or Common Markets. Major trading groups exist in every region of the world, and it is impossible to cover every group in every union. So we'll discuss a few of the major ones and examine the type of RTA they are. First is the European Union. The largest and most comprehensive regional economic group is the European Union, or EU. It began by gradually abolishing internal tariffs but eventually established an external tariff while integrating in other ways, such as facilitating the free movement of workers, establishing a common agricultural policy, and agreeing on a value-added tax system. The formation of the European Parliament and the establishment of a common currency, the euro make the Europe the most ambitious of all the regional trade groups. Although the 27 member of Europe is easily the dominant trading bloc in Europe, it's not the only one. Founded in 1960, the four-member European Free Trade Association or EFTA also maintains joint free trade agreements with several other countries. The European Economic Area or EEA includes 3 members of the EFTA and all members of the Euro. The Central European Free Trade Agreement or CEFTA was originally formed to integrate Western practices into the economies of former Soviet bloc nations, 2 of whom have already been admitted into the EU. Regional Economic Integration in Asia, which is the officially approved RTAs, the most important is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations or ASEAN Free Trade Area. Successful as in Europe or North America because most of the countries in the region have relied on US and Europe markets for as much as 20 to 30% of their exports. Regional Economic Integration in America. The 2 major groups in South America are the Andean Community or CAN and the Southern Common Market or Mercosur. The Andean Community is a custom union whereas Mercosur is set up to be a common market. The focus of economic integration has shifted from the concept of a free trade agreement to that of the common market. The proposed structure of the Caribbean Community and Common Market or CARICOM is modeled on that of the EU. Next is the regional economic integration in Africa. Between 2001 to 2010, 6 of the fastest growing economies in the world were in Africa. Real GDP growth has been strong and the FDI has risen significantly. In addition, Africa has the fastest expanding labor force in the world with more than 500 million people of working age, 15 to 64, and is expected to surpass China and India in the working age population by 2040. Other forms of international cooperations. The first form of cooperation worth exploring is the United Nations, which was established in 1945 in response to the devastation of World War II. It promotes international peace and security and to help solve global problems in such diverse areas as economic development and anti-terrorism and humanitarian actions. Next is non-government organizations or NGOs. Non-governmental, non-profit voluntary organizations are all lumped under the category of NGOs, which is the private institutions that are independent on any government. Some NGOs separate only within the confines of a specific country, whereas others are international in scope.
Commodity agreements. Commodities refer to raw materials or primary products that enter into trade such as metals or agricultural products. Primary commodity exports such as crude, petroleum, natural gas, copper, tobacco, coffee, cocoa, tea, and sugar are still important to developing countries. Out of 151 developing countries, 100, two-thirds of the total, derive more than 50% of their export value from commodities. Commodity agreements, on the other hand, these are the arrangement between producing and consuming countries to stabilize markets and raise the average prices. Commodity agreements often involve intervention schemes such as buffer stocks and usually only last for a few years, whereupon they are renegotiated. The commodity agreements are different from cartels such as OPEC. The meaning of OPEC is the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, and we're gonna tackle it on the next slide. Largely because commodity agreement discussions and negotiations involve both producer and consumer countries. Unlike cartels, which is the under of it is the OPEC, are established to protect the interests of the producers only. Commodities and the world economy. Both long-term trends and short-term fluctuations in commodity prices have important consequences for the world economy. On the demand side, commodity markets play an important role in the industrial countries, transmitting business cycle disturbances to the rest of the economy and affecting the growth rate of prices. On the supply side, as noted above, primary products account for a significant portion of the GDP and exports of many commodities. Commodity price fluctuations, along with the globalization of the world economy and increased liberalization of commodity markets, have led to profound changes that seriously affect the weaker economies of the developing world. World commodity prices being notoriously volatile, driven by changes in global demand and supply, developing countries are particularly affected by external shocks that can result in increased poverty and reduce the public funding for health and education. Early attempts to deal with commodity price volatility relied on the stabilization schemes set up into context of international commodity agreements. These arrangements were largely unsuccessful. Globalization of commodity markets and lowering of trade barriers, along with priorities focused on sustainable development and poverty alleviation, call for more innovative approach to commodity risk management. The concerns of all interested parties such as traders, governments, producers, and farmers should be taken into account. Consumers and producers. For many years, countries tried to band together as producer alliances or joint producer or consumer alliances to try to stabilize commodity prices. However, these efforts, with the exception of the OPEC, or the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. As what I've said earlier, the OPECs are only established to protect the interests of producers only. That's why it is exceptional. The Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries is an example of a producer cartel that relies on quotas to influence prices. It is a group of 12 oil-producing countries that have significant control over supply and band together to control output and price. Its members include Algeria, Angola, Ecuador, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Libya, Nigeria, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Venezuela. Indonesia suspended its membership in January 2009, and several of the largest oil exporting countries, including Russia, Norway, Canada, the US, and Mexico, are not members of OPEC. So we all know that those 12 member of the OPEC, or the 12 countries who are member of the OPEC, are those countries who are rich in oil, so that they are able to export their product, which is oil, to the other countries.